Hi, The Local Project. I'm Madeleine Blanchfield of Madeleine Blanchfield Architects.
And I'm Nick Tobias of Tobias Partners. And today we'll be answering the most asked questions in architecture. Madeleine, what are the most common mistakes that clients make during the design process?
There's one thing that I've noticed over the years, and I've actually done the same thing myself, so I think it's just human nature. But when clients have lived in a house for a long time and then they come to either knock it down or renovate it, there is this really intense inclination to keep things in the same place that they've been before. So with fresh eyes you can go, the kitchen definitely shouldn't go here, it should go there. And it's very consistent that people just can't kind of get their head around that.
Shake it.
And I understand it. You've got all these memories of, that space. And so I guess that's more an observation.
I think a mistake that they can make is bringing their marital issues to the process.
Yeah.
That doesn't help design.
Yeah. I mean, we have to have aligned sort of, if we have client architect, that client has to be the one entity, I think, or it can get very
That's
tricky.
right. Using the design process as therapy isn't great.
And sometimes shopping around the design before it's still in
Absolutely.
flux, probably not a great idea to show 10 people and get their feedback.
You know what, you've raised the number one mistake. Is clients who have to go and get 1,000 opinions and can't trust the process between them and their architect, and they've got to ask their friends and they've got to ask their family and they've got all this input and they get totally bamboozled by it all, and it just is no good for the process.
It can be very confusing. And the problem is the people seeing it aren't privy to all the backstory or what, everything that's gone into it.
Totally.
Nick, why do architects always fight with builders?
Architects don't always fight with builders. We have been privileged over many years to work with a number of fantastic builders who are ultimately our collaborators. I often say to clients the most important relationship in your whole project is the relationship between our office and the site foreman, because it's that site foreman who is taking all of the information, and it's for them to be able to see what that vision is. And it's an unbelievably difficult task. We've had very few fights with builders over many years, and I think that comes down to great builder selection, working with builders who have a shared vision, working with builders who understand the value that we bring to the project and understand the value that they bring to the project, and very good clients who are trusting of those builders.
I've learnt more from builders, foremen that I've worked with over the years than possibly anyone else. When you have someone really skilled who knows what they're doing, the two-way information exchange is incredible, and I've really learnt, especially about detailing and construction, a lot from some very good builders. There's an idea sometimes that the architect's role can stop when construction starts, and that's an absolute disaster for us and for the project if it happens. What was your experience like designing your own home? Are architects like doctors in that they make the worst patients? This question makes me think of a quote that doctors bury their patients and architects cover theirs in plants. They're deceased patients.
I love designing for myself. It's a very natural, fluid process. I suppose it's more like a painter painting a painting. You just do it completely on your own terms, and there's no structure around the process, and there's no particular timeline that you have to stick to, and there's no moments where you have to present, there's no convincing anyone else of your ideas. It just flows out.
I probably had quite a different experience because I had another architect to work with who I'm married to, so that whole completely independent flow of ideas was slightly hampered by having to get agreement on everything. But it does feel very natural because I think you do all this thinking about everything all the time, and then when you come to do it for yourself, you already know. And you also get to take a few risks that you may not necessarily take on clients, both construction and materials and maybe a bit with spaces. I feel very fortunate to have been able to do that, and I'd love to do it again because I think you just keep testing the waters.
Is it true that only the wealthy can afford to commission an architect to design their house?
No, definitely not. The most important thing is that the brief and the budget and the client's expectations are all aligned. And the architect's fee is a relatively small part of an overall project, and it's a percentage of the cost of the project. So if we do a very small project, we don't get paid very much for it. But hopefully our input is proportionally just as significant as if it's a huge project. But there are also some of our most rewarding projects have been tiny little cabins and things that we've done, and everyone has a great time doing them. And I think the client's benefit is probably more in a project like that sometimes than on a huge big house.
We had an interesting discussion in the studio the other day, and we were asking ourselves, just within a small group of us, you know, what is it that really makes a project a yes rather than a no? At no point did we actually talk about the value. That to me was testament that it really doesn't matter whether the project's a $50,000 project or a $15 million project. We would love to work on it. We would love to add value to it. You know, we'd love to be part of the process.
Yeah, I completely agree. When people call our office, we ask their budget and their brief, and that's not because we have a cut-off of what we'll work on. It's just to make sure that what they're trying to do is actually achievable within the budget that they have.
Sometimes we'll get a call, and it might be a young family looking to do a project, and they're really constrained in terms of budget. And I will suggest to them that they work with another architect, and maybe I'll refer to another architect who I know is an up-and-coming architect looking for work.
It's never a malicious thing when we decline something. It's just that you've got to be aligned on every level. And if it's not us that's aligned, there probably is someone else.
Yeah, I think the important thing for us and the important thing in our studio is that we're respected for our time, that we're paid for our time because it's valued.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, we'll add as much value as we can.
What is your favourite room to design in a house?
It's a really hard question. Despite my love of aesthetics and my love of all things beautiful, and this is beauty, by the way, my favourite room in my house is my shed. Designing my shed, so dealing with sports equipment, gardening equipment, tools, all those types of things. Absolutely love it. Over to you.
It is a hard question. Maybe project dependent, like once you've got the bones of the house coming together and you sort of know where everything's going and what its essence is going to be, then you might fall in love with one space in particular and want to give it more attention. If I had to just pick one, it's possibly the kitchen, which is a bit masochistic because kitchens are a nightmare, but it's like when you crack it, you know, it's almost like designing a car.
Yeah, the first thing that popped into my mind was kitchens and bathrooms because they're the most intensive part of the house in terms of all the machinations and all the things to work out.
My fun one would be my wardrobe. My wardrobe is your shed. That's got to work.
Madeleine, why does someone need an architect to design their home? Why can't they just use a good builder?
Very good question. I would say that architects and builders have very different roles or jobs. The architect's definitely safe on paper, whereas when a builder gets involved, it's very real usually. So the architect has training in space planning, flow of spaces, dealing with councils and council regulations, and also that creative and the feeling of a space usually is what an architect can inject, and they should be able to interpret a brief and bring that back in a way that is a beautiful design that the client then wants to proceed with. There may be some builders who can do that, but usually that front end is the realm of the architect.
I would say that you've been extremely kind to builders. And with my deepest respect for many of the fantastic builders that we work for, it's not their strength and it's not their space, generally speaking. Most of our clients want exceptional design, they want to push the boundaries, they want to do things that feel fantastic, and that is really in the realm of the architect. And we spend all those years studying and being mentored and practicing to be able to do that.
5, 6, 7, 10 years of training in space and light and creativity is something that is really hard for people to probably grasp. You can't underestimate that time spent Even just getting a sense of scale and proportion, materiality.
We have to be an expert at so many different things. We have to be the mathematician, and we have to be the scientist, and we have to be the lawyer, and we have to be the town planner, and we have to be all of these things. But above all, we have to be able to synthesise all of those inputs and all of those elements into something that's beautiful and graceful and, as you said before, feels good.
If I describe our work to people who don't know much about it, I often say we're like curators. We're taking all of this input, the constraints, the inspirations, we're trying to spit out something magical. That is not easy, but when you do it, it's very rewarding. Having all of those hats does mean that our job very rarely gets boring.
Completely agree. Madeleine, is it true that architect design houses always go over budget and over time?
Ouch.
I'm glad you're starting and not me.
Yeah, no, definitely not always. Architect design houses are bespoke. They've never been done before, and they will never be done again by virtue of being on one site, and that's what the design is for. There's a lot of moving parts and a lot of things that need to be managed and a lot of different people involved, and so controlling cost and time is hard, but we just have to manage it as a priority. It's even written into our fee proposals that we have to get a cost plan 3 or 4 times throughout. We never want a client to fall in love with something and then not be able to afford it.
I really don't believe that the budget can be set from the very, very outset on a residential home like it can be on a commercial project.
I mean, you can only really talk in square metre rates when someone rings up initially, but we will always be very clear, like, that's not possible if it's really not possible. And it does frustrate me when they find someone who says that is possible, because you just know where that's going to land in 2 years' time.
Look, there are definitely some architects around who throw around these unrealistically low square metre rates, and it makes it really, really hard for people like you and me who like to call as it is from the beginning.
The cost of building in the last few years has exploded, and that's been something that is incredibly hard to manage.
The fact that construction prices have moved northwards as they have made it really difficult. We've had projects where a year and a half, 2 years ago, I gave clients a square metre rate that today aren't the same square metre rates. I mean, let's be honest, all of our buildings are quite expensive, but there's a range even in that. And a lot of our concepts can be executed in a 7 out of 10 way in terms of price, or a 10 or even 11 out of 10 way in terms of price. We're very happy to do it as a 7 out of 10 every time, because I think as architects, that's what we envisage in our mind. It's the concept in its purest form. But clients generally, and in the areas that we work, they love luxury, and more often than not, they will choose to have a little more of this and a little more of that, and all of those things add up to a lot of money in the end.
I mean, my house has no finishes in it, exactly the same. All I care about is the space.
Yeah.
If I had to make the choice, it's the space rather than the finishes.
It's the space, the light, the ventilation,
yeah.
all of those fundamentals. Here's a curly one for us.
Oh, great.
When should a client also commission an interior designer for their project? And do you like working with an interior designer, or do you prefer to design both elements of the house?
Okay, well, I'm going to be very straight up on this one. We very rarely work with interior designers. I have great friends who are interior designers. I have a huge amount of respect for interior designers. But the way we work is that we see a house as one entity, and we don't really separate the inside and the outside and the spaces and the finishes. You know,
you've answered the question perfectly and exactly how I would have answered it. We've always seen it as one continuum from inside to outside. You know, we enjoy working with landscape designers on landscape. We have an input, we have a point of view.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the architecture and the interiors and everything that's attached to that, it's one holistic thing. And when I look back over decades and even centuries, the most beautiful buildings were always done that way.
Yeah.
You know, they were never separated into the architect and the interior designer.
It has potential on a house to create some sort of tensions that are just not necessary. And if the client wanted to bring an interior designer to the project, we'd say, well, let's be on the same team and do it together, as opposed to sort of drawing a line somehow, because that just doesn't work.
And it's also really important because it means that as a practice, from the very, very outset of space planning the architecture, we're also thinking about the furniture. And when I say the furniture, we're thinking about the people who use the furniture.
Yeah.
So we're creating a very human experience in the architecture from the very outset through the lens of decoration.
The house is only 70% finished until it's furnished, and by the time you get to that point, you know the client so well. We've been looking at renderings of all the rooms. If those renderings don't have furniture in them, it's not setting the tone at all, really. So we try from the outset to be thinking about what the major pieces would be. It affects how you do the lighting and
Totally.
PowerPoints, everything. Nick, how will AI change the design process for you?
I recently met with somebody who's got real expertise in this space to try and get an understanding of where it might be going and how it would influence us. He was the CEO of a very, very large architectural firm where AI has totally revolutionised what they do. But this is a commercial multinational firm with a $10 or $11 billion pipeline of work. So very, very different to us. The good news, if you see it as good news, was practices like ours who work on these very, very finely detailed bespoke projects, we will be the last to be impacted, really. Because everything we do is so original. Everything we do really, really requires that human touch. However, in terms of how it could be of great benefit, as AI gets more advanced, that you can input all the previous work that you've done, and the AI model gets a sense of how you approach things, just like your staff might get a sense of how you approach things. And what your staff do is they help you progress your design. I know the way that I work, I do sketches and have discussions, and the team in the office are building it up, usually on a computer, initially as a sketch design, then developing into a concept design. But my input is very, very manual. And I'm hopeless at CAD and all of those types of things. As the AI model develops, that process is going to be done by the AI, and it's going to go incredibly quickly.
My understanding of AI so far is that the questions you ask it or the input is everything. So it's not at a stage where it's just going to take off and do our job for us. It's more about learning how to use it to its best capabilities. But I do wonder sometimes if I'm doing a sketch design, it is almost like cracking a mathematical equation. You've got all these variables and all these constraints, and a lot of it is actually just mental number crunching. And so the idea that you could sort of have AI do that for you would be amazing. But I also, I'm a huge fan of testing things, and the idea that you could test 50 different slight variations on something very, very quickly instead of having someone sitting there running, renders all night. And I think that's super exciting. But where it starts to come in touch with the very beginning of creativity and ideas, I guess that's something that only time will tell.
Madeleine, how do you handle a client who just wants you to design something you've already done, or shows you photos of other houses and says, "Can I have this?"
So there's a couple of layers to that question. I mean, hopefully a client's come to us because they like our work. So it's not necessarily a bad thing if they say, "I love that house." We're obviously never going to do the same thing twice. And the whole showing photos of work is a complexity in what we do, because we want to understand what they like and what they're hoping to achieve. But at the same time, it's very easy to take a photo from Pinterest that is a house that's 3 times the size in Brazil that's just not going to translate to your 10-metre wide eastern suburbs blocks. So I guess we would approach that as trying to understand the essence of what they like about a previous house.
I often find myself having to say to clients, trust the process.
And it's hard to do. We do it every day. I can imagine if you're coming in cold, trusting a process which involves kind of going off into the wilderness, getting a bit lost, being confused and not having all the answers, and just allowing yourself to run with that, with the faith that you will get there at the end, is what it's all about. Nick, where do you look for inspiration in design?
I think the first thing I'd like to say about inspiration is that it happens over a very long period of time. I don't like to think about inspiration as something that you go out and get. It's something that has been building and bubbling away over many years and many years of doing what we do. There are a few architects in the world whose work I do find truly inspiring, and that probably hasn't changed for 20 years. They're probably the same architects. And there's a few books on those architects that I've had for 20 years, and if I had to pick 4 or 5 books, they'd be the same books today as they were then.
Definitely there are a few architects that, well, there are a few buildings that just take your breath away, and that feeling of either wanting to burst into tears or, it sounds melodramatic, but there are a few buildings that really do that to you, and I think if we're always striving to have that much power in our work, then that's incredibly inspiring.
The arrival of Pinterest was a big game changer in our practice. I remember before that, clients used to come in and often they'd either have a scrapbook or they'd have, one of those books full of plastic sleeves and all these things that they'd torn out of magazines or photocopied out of books. Their capacity to tour the world for all the design you could possibly see, which you can now do in the digital age, wasn't there. And it made them think really hard about what they wanted. Whereas now, in the digital age, people are influenced and influenced and influenced and influenced. And I think what it does is it homogenises everything. And you find that everybody comes with the same image.
Yeah.
They're all like, I want to do this house, and it's the same image. We've all seen it 1,000 times.
And I always go and pull out my old books on random architects that no one's ever heard of.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you just, you can't sort of have an original idea.
Yeah. If there's one building that you didn't design but wish you did, what would it be?
Whew.
It's like asking you, what's your favourite song?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I mean, this is such a cliche one, but the Barcelona Pavilion, Mies van der Rohe, is just the feeling you get when you go there. And he was really, at that time, he ripped planning apart and changed the way we look at buildings completely. And I still, in space planning, follow his, lead, like separating all the walls, looking at things as blades.
I do have a favourite architect, I think, and that's Peter Zumthor. I went to the spa that he designed in Vals called Therm, and that was the most extraordinary experience. Putting aside whether you like the building, the aesthetics, it was monastic, it was emotional, it was just an unbelievable experience the whole way through the building and the way you move through it. It was just, the feeling of it was amazing. And if I want to be really corny and cliche, Sydney Opera House.
Yeah, I just didn't say that because it's sort of... But
you wanted to leave the really corny stuff for me.
That is like a gobsmackingly incredible building, and I think it's almost goes without saying. Yeah.
And it's amazing how you can grow up and live in a city, and it's a building that we've all seen, endlessly our whole life, that you don't stop marvelling at it. Every time I go past it on a boat, every time I walk up those steps, every time I'm close to it and run my hands along the tiles on the sails, I'm nearly 50 and it still amazes me.
Yeah.
It still constantly amazes me.
A masterpiece.
Yeah.
Nick, what is the first thing you ask a potential new client, and what is the first thing they should ask you?
One of the things I try and find out as quickly as I possibly can is this person commercially driven or emotionally driven? Because we're a practice that's set up to deal with people who are emotionally invested in their project. And although we've done bits and pieces of work for commercial entities over the years, I think we do our best work for families, really.
We're doing houses mostly, and there's only that many ways a house can go together, usually dependent on the site. So it's the client who's our real inspiration for us, and having someone who's invested emotionally and intellectually in it and who brings something, whether that's their family or their cultural background or their passions, it's really important for us, because otherwise you're sort of doing the same thing over and over.
I was having a conversation with someone just yesterday about how much will the client be able to bring their own personal voice and style to the project in the context of us having quite a strong architectural approach. And I said that over 25 years of doing this, I think our best project outcomes have been where clients have brought themselves to the project and they have to do the work to do that. We're completely open to it. And when they share themselves emotionally, spiritually, culturally, all of those things with the project is much better for it.
Absolutely. And in a way, the more constraints, like the harder they push or the more finite their brief, and I think that actually forces us to do better work.
I think maybe the first thing that a client should ask me when they call, and nobody's ever asked me this, is how much do you love what you do?
That's a very good answer. I don't know if I can top that.
What's the best lesson you've learnt throughout your career?
If I had to come up with one thing, I'd probably say enjoy the ride, enjoy the process. So I think that flows down into everything else. And if you're not enjoying it, your clients probably aren't enjoying it, and then people who work with you aren't going to get that feeling of enjoyment.
I think for me, it's build the right culture and the rest follows, which is similar to yours in some ways, because without the right culture you cannot enjoy the ride, and you can put all the effort into process and how you do things, but if the culture's not right, it's never going to be right.
What's the point if everyone's not sort of happily working towards the same goal?
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to us answer the most asked questions in architecture.